The date was July 27, 1934, a humid evening in Chicago. The Biograph Theater offered air-conditioned insulation against the hot night. The feature was a gangster picture with Clark Gable playing a good egg gone bad, a tough guy who liked women as much as they liked him. The show let out, and the real drama started. Police shot a man dead on the sidewalk that evening. The newsreels quickly rushed the official story into theaters. Federal agents had gunned down America's most wanted criminal. But was it true, or was the shooting simply a cover for one of the most daring escapes from a career in crime ever? He was born John Herbert Dillinger. The family always pronounced the name with a soft G. His mother died when he was a child, but his father did his best to raise Johnny, his older sister Audrey, and 2 children by his second wife. Little Johnny didn't like his stepmother, but that wasn't uncommon. When the Dillingers moved from urban Indianapolis to rural Mooresville, Johnny had trouble adjusting to farm life. He wasn't much for school, but bright and loved baseball and shooting pool. The father of a girl John was in love with scotched their planned marriage. She would marry a man with money, not a poor, no-account farm boy. Upset, John Dillinger impulsively stole a car. Fearing arrest, he joined the Navy, but life in uniform held no appeal. 6 months later, he went AWOL, for good. Back in Mooresville, the 20-year-old Dillinger married a local girl, played more baseball for the Mooresville team, foolishly befriending the 31-year-old umpire Edgar Singleton, an ex-con. After too many beers, they slugged 65-year-old Frank Morgan with a metal pipe and robbed him. Old man Morgan, a compassionate cop, and Dillinger's father all believed young John's remorse and encouraged him to beg the court for leniency. He did, and received 10 years in the Indiana Reformatory. Even police thought it was a raw deal. Dillinger attempted at least 4 escapes in the first year, but was always caught. Authorities sent Dillinger to state prison to try to teach him a lesson. He learned well, picking up bank robbing tips from experts like Three-Finger Jack Hamilton, Harry Pierpoint, a dapper lone wolf with a vile temper. Paroled in 1933, Dillinger hit a string of banks on a list written by Hamilton. Several of them had gone belly up in the Depression, but total hauls were enough to supply enough guns and money to engineer a breakout of his 4 friends in the state pen. Between bank robberies, he hung out with a lovely girl named Mary Longacre, taking in the Chicago Century of Progress World's Fair. Dillinger's audacious sense of humor prompted him to hand Mary's camera to a cop and ask him to take their picture. Mary's nosy landlady turned Dillinger over to the police, and he landed in the Lima, Ohio jail. Meantime, Harry Pierpoint, Charles Mackley, Russell Clark, and John Hamilton broke out of prison thanks to Dillinger and decided to return the favor. 5 days later, they arrived at the Lima jail to free Dillinger. To Dillinger's disgust, Pierpoint shot Sheriff Jess Sarber to death in front of his horrified wife. Dillinger looked at bank robbery as a precision assault. First, observation and surveillance, spotting guards and alarms. Using a floor plan and a specific getaway strategy, everything was rehearsed and timed by stopwatch. The gang hit a bank in Racine, Wisconsin for $27,000, then another in East Chicago for $20,000 more. Against Dillinger's orders, Charles Mackley impulsively shot a cop during the robbery. 11 days after the East Chicago bank job, police took the gang into custody in Tucson, Arizona. The gang members were transported back by train, but Dillinger was flown under guard back to Crown Point. He slept calmly, awakened at every refueling stop by hordes of reporters. At Crown Point Jail, armed men patrol perimeter. Inside, Sheriff Lillian Hawley, who inherited the job from her late husband, posed with the celebrity criminal, telling him the jail was escape-proof. That struck him as funny. Meantime, the other gang members had returned to Ohio to stand trial for the murder of Sheriff Sarber. In time, security relaxed at Crown Point. Dillinger planned his escape. According to legend, he carved a wooden pistol from an old washboard. Dyeing the carving with shoe polish, he faked out police and escaped his cell. Dillinger encouraged the fable, but the truth was probably more prosaic. A bribe from his lawyer and a cop who looked the other way. The wooden gun story diverted attention from police already humiliated about the escape. Dillinger stole the sheriff's own car, grabbing the garage attendant for company, singing songs as he raced out of town into the open Ohio countryside.
How did he act? Was he jolly?
Yes, he sang part of the way.
What did he sing?
Little dog, get along, little dog, get along.
That's so.
Dillinger erred when he crossed the state line into Illinois in the sheriff's stolen car. Interstate transport of stolen property was a federal offense. J. Edgar Hoover took personal affront at Dillinger and named him public enemy number 1. He used the bandit's image on the FBI target range, though Dillinger was far less harmful to society than bigwigs like Luciano and Capone. FBI agent Melvin Purvis was the field officer charged with the capture of John Dillinger, focusing in the Chicago area. But Dillinger was in Minnesota, forming another gang that now included Homer Van Meter and Babyface Nelson, a violent veteran of Chicago's Bugs gang. Hoover put a $10,000 bounty on Dillinger, dead or alive. With similar awards from several states, people became greedy and tried to collect that money. Plenty of innocent men were jailed and sometimes nearly killed, having been mistakenly identified as John Dillinger. Dillinger visited his family farm for a Sunday chicken dinner. He told his concerned father not to worry, that he was going on a long trip soon. In Warsaw, Indiana, Dillinger woke the town's sole policeman, Jed Pittenger, to open the armory. Dillinger left with a small arsenal, without harming Pittenger. In Chicago, Dillinger gave his attorney, Louis Paquette, a large stash of cash, telling him he planned a long vacation. Easily eluding a multi-state dragnet, Dillinger and his men headed to picturesque Spider Lake, Wisconsin. With him was steady girlfriend Billy Frechette. The group rented rooms at a fishing resort called Little Bohemia. The owner of the motel tipped off the FBI, which surrounded the lodge in the dead of night. They spotted 3 customers emerging and opened fire. Police killed an innocent civilian Conservation Corps worker and wounded 2 of his friends. Babyface Nelson and his wife fled at the sound of gunfire, killing an FBI agent in their flight through the woods. All night, the FBI blasted the motel with machine gun fire, causing tremendous damage. 2 men were wounded, 2 others dead. In fact, Dillinger, Van Meter, and Carroll were gone at the first sound of gunshots many hours before, leaving their girlfriends cowering in the basement. Dillinger had planned to help his pals escape from prison, but it was impossible. Pierpoint and Mackley were sentenced to electrocution for the murder of Sheriff Sarber, and Russell Clark got a life sentence. In South Bend, Indiana, the Merchants National Bank fell to a violent armed robbery with the criminals opening up with machine gun fire. Police and FBI agents insisted the crude break-in was the work of Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, and Pretty Boy Floyd, none of whom were even in the state at the time. It was in the FBI's best interest to paint Dillinger as a cold-blooded killer, and reporters ate up the myth. It sold newspapers. In July 1934, a crooked cop named Martin Zarkovich offered a deal to Captain John Steege. He and girlfriend Anna Sage, a prostitute and madam with a record as long as Zarkovich's own, could deliver Dillinger on two conditions. One, the Chicago PD would prevent the feds from deporting Anna. Two, Dillinger had to be shot, not taken alive. The Chicago police captain kicked Zarkovich out. Zarkovich then went to FBI agent Melvin Purvis, who went for the deal. Zarkovich told him about a certain local crook named Jimmy Lawrence, who was really John Dillinger. Lawrence would be at the Biograph Theater with Anna Sage and another girl, Holly Hamilton. Though the FBI took credit, Zarkovich actually shot the man named James Lawrence at the Biograph Theater.
I had no unobstructed view of everything before me, since the distance is but a short one to an alley. Then in quick, rapid succession, I heard two shots, just instantaneous, and a man lay motionless on the street, blood all over him. I tried to rush to their assistance, thinking that maybe two gangsters were fighting. So I brought some water from the garage and a sprinkling can. But a federal agent held me back and said, no more use to help them. He is gone now. And I said, who is gone? Why, he says, that's Dillinger.
Huge crowds gawked at the body. The FBI and coroner explained that Dillinger had secretly received plastic surgery to alter his looks, although there were no surgical scars visible or noted on the autopsy report. The dead man apparently received eye and heart surgery as well. The corpse had brown eyes. Dillinger's were blue. Dillinger had been athletic. The corpse showed a chronic rheumatic heart that would have led to his death rather soon had he not been shot. Shorter and heavier than Dillinger, the corpse also lacked the birthmarks, scars, and wounds scrupulously noted during Dillinger's many visits to prison. The FBI reneged on its promise to the lady in red. Anna Sage received the $10,000 reward, but was still deported. Agent Melvin Purvis quit the FBI in disgust in 1936. J. Edgar Hoover, who hated anyone in the FBI receiving publicity except himself, removed Purvis' name from the official history of the Dillinger case. Purvis committed suicide in 1960. Hoover kept mementos of the shooting at the Biograph Theater on display at FBI headquarters, including a death mask of the victim, his straw hat, glasses, and a thrown-down gun found by Zarkovich. Privately, Hoover credited the Dillinger capture to Clyde Tolson, second in command at the FBI, and Hoover's life partner. In truth, Tolson never had a field assignment in his entire career. Dillinger's family went on the vaudeville circuit, recalling the life of their famous relative for paying audiences. The body of the man shot at the Biograph Theater was buried in Mooresville Cemetery in a coffin enclosed by 3 solid feet of concrete. The elder Dillinger said it was to make sure souvenir hunters never disturbed his son. Others have called it the tomb of the unknown gangster. For months, John Dillinger had told people he planned to take a long trip. One way or the other, he did. Violent crime is primarily a man's domain, which makes the few women lawbreakers stand out that much more. Hard-edged Ma Barker, criminal and mother hen of a killer brood of psychopaths and robbers, gunned down by federal agents in 1935. Ruth Snyder, convinced her lover, Judd Gray, to bash in Mr. Snyder's head for his insurance. Ruth became uniquely famous when a New York Daily News reporter snapped a photo just as the electric chair was activated. But in a century of crime, no woman has ever been more glorified and whitewashed than Bonnie Parker, the distaff half of Bonnie and Clyde. Portrayed in films by Gene Harvey, Dorothy Provine, and most famously Faye Dunaway, Bonnie was a cute white trash psychopath whose sex drive bordered on mania.
Good afternoon. This is the Barrel Gang.
We rob.
Warren Beatty, Faye Dunaway, Bonnie and Clyde.
I ain't much of a lover boy. That don't mean nothing personal about you. I never saw no percentage in it.
Her partner in crime was no Prince Charming or Robin Hood. From childhood onward, Clyde Barrow preferred robbing and running to honest work, emulating his older brother Buck. After a string of petty robberies, rarely netting him more than $50 apiece, Clyde ended up behind bars. Bonnie Parker was 97 pounds, 19 years old, and married to a man serving 99 years for murder. Killing time working as a waitress, she thought Clyde was going places. He was, to jail for a burglary in Waco, where he stupidly left his fingerprints. Bonnie smuggled a gun into him and he escaped, only to get caught again and thrown into brutal Eastham prison in Texas, where he picked up the naughty habit of sodomy. Paroled 20 months later, Clyde again teamed with Bonnie, and their exploits began to make headlines throughout the Midwest. To the thousands hit by the Depression, newspaper and radio reports of the daring hold-up pair and their wild car chases were wish fulfillment. But their biggest bank haul was a mere $1,500. Usually they'd end less than $100, murdering to get it. In a robbery spree lasting from February 1932 to May 1934, they shot and killed at least 13 people, kidnapping and assaulting others, usually storekeepers or police. As a gag, fun-loving Bonnie flagged down a cop to ask directions, then blew his head off with a shotgun. They knocked over at least 2 armories, and Clyde took loving care of his stolen weapons, giving nicknames to each one. Barrow's gun collection seemed like phallic symbolism run wild. With the law after them in several states, they also amassed a convenient collection of stolen license plates to throw off pursuers. They were both narcissists, posing for photos, spoofing their image. Papers ran the photos and poetry that Bonnie had written, which supported their public image as star-crossed young lovers. After kidnapping a police chief, Bonnie told her hostage, "Tell the public I don't really smoke cigars. That's the bunk." Less than an hour after this photo was taken by Buck Barrow, a posse burst through the trees. Buck was mortally wounded and his wife Blanche was captured. Bonnie and Clyde got away. Not everyone admired the low-paying, gun-toting exploits of this redneck pair. In prison, John Dillinger said, "These punks give bank robbery a bad name." A dragnet of 1,000 police and guardsmen combed the fields and woods for the couple, but they eluded capture. Clyde swore he'd never go back to prison. Bonnie just swore. Near Grapevine, Texas, Bonnie and Clyde passed the time drinking and making love in their car, shooting drunkenly at squirrels. 2 passing motorcycle policemen, E.G. Wheeler and H.D. Murphy, investigated the disturbance. Without a second thought, Bonnie and Clyde shot them both dead, Bonnie delivering an unnecessary final shot to the head. Texas Ranger Frank Hamer took the hunt personally. Coordinating his posse with a second force under Louisiana Sheriff Horn, Hamer and Elkhorn convinced a friend of the Barrow Gang to double-cross the murderers. Henry Melvin lured Bonnie and Clyde onto a rutted road outside of Giblin, Louisiana. Unaware of the trap, Clyde was driving in his socks. Bonnie was eating a sandwich.
It looks like the car, fellas. That's him for sure, I'll guarantee you. Get ready now. That's him, fellas. If he reaches for it, let him have it. Look out!
This amateur film was shot minutes after the ambush. In death, her bullet-riddled body leans against Clyde in a final embrace. The death car became a collector's item, still on exhibit more than 60 years later in Las Vegas, the dozens of ragged bullet holes giving witness to the violent end of its most infamous owners. On that day in 1934, it had been a rolling arsenal, hiding 2 sawed-off shotguns, 2 machine rifles, 10 automatic pistols, and 1,500 rounds of ammunition. Bonnie's makeup kit laid nearby. Barrow's body was pierced by 54 bullets, his hand severed at the wrist. Most of the 187 bullets went right through the driver's door and Barrow into Bonnie Parker, who was caught in the crossfire. Bonnie had just gotten herself a permanent and a manicure. Clyde Barrow's funeral became a media circus, with popcorn and lemonade stands set up for the huge crowd. By comparison, Bonnie's funeral was intimate. Only 150 friends and family, including Clyde Barrow's parents. Also in attendance was Bonnie's sister, on special leave from prison and flanked by a prison matron and 2 deputies. Years later, after her own release from prison for unrelated crimes, elderly Billie Mae Parker read a poem written by her notorious sister, which showed that Bonnie foresaw her own bloody end.
Someday they will go down together, and they will bury them side by side. To a few it means grief, to the law it's relief, but it's death to Bonnie and Clyde.
Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid ushered in crime from the 19th to the 20th century, the last in a long line of robber gangs on the frontier, learning from the mistakes of their predecessors. The swarthy Reno brothers were the first gang to hold up a train in 1866. With murder, violence, and armed robbery, they terrorized honest citizens in 3 states for 2 years until captured. A vigilante band broke into their cells and lynched the Reno brothers one at a time.
Give us the keys. All right, boys. Oh. No, you can't. Break! Break! This one next, man. Break!
Yes, you have. You got a lot of good stuff.
No! You gotta give us a trial! No!
Brother Simon fought for his life and took a full half hour to strangle to death in his noose. The James gang followed in their wake. Led by young Jesse James, they were beloved by Confederate sympathizers as modern-day Robin Hoods. But Jesse in killing witnesses, bystanders, or bank employees. He died in 1882, shot in the back. His elder brother Frank survived, appearing at fairs and Wild West shows, dying peacefully in 1915 at age 62. There were the Youngers, the Daltons, the Buckners, the Red Sash Gang, and laughable Al Jennings and his brothers. After a 5-year stretch in prison, Al moved to California to make cowboy movies, showing more aptitude for crime on screen than in real life. These were the contemporaries of Robert Parker, born in 1866. Calm, bright, and attractive, he learned his trade from outlaw Mike Cassidy. Cassidy taught the teenage boy how to rustle cattle and use a six-shooter. The boy became a better shot than any other apprentice outlaw in Utah Territory. Cassidy disappeared after killing a rancher. Young Parker took his name and leadership of his gang. Bank robberies and rustling made the robbers wealthy, but they spent their loot fast and had to keep stealing. Laying low, Cassidy took a brief job as a butcher, giving the rest of his name Butch Cassidy. Butch hired himself out to prevent cattle rustling. If a rancher paid the right price, Butch stuck around long enough to drive off rustlers. If ranchers refused to pay, Butch stole the cattle himself. The protection racket proved lucrative, but it landed Butch in state prison. 2 years later, the paroled Cassidy sought out the Hole in the Wall, a natural fortress in the Wyoming mountains where Butch crossed paths with every notorious robber working the West, including the fastest draw in the territory, gunman Harry Longbaugh. After Harry's stretch in Sundance jail, they called him the Sundance Kid. With members of the Wild Bunch as back, Butch robbed trains. He tried to remain polite, avoiding homicide, but used dynamite to make his point.
Dynamite's ready, Butch.
Well, that ought to do it.
Think you used enough dynamite there, Butch?
Most of this is true, and all of it blazes with action. You've never met a pair like Butch and Sundance.
You just keep thinking, Butch. That's what you're good at.
An incredible pair of rugged adventurers.
Led by manhunters like Charlie Siringo, N.K. Boswell, and finally Joe LaForce, mounted posses of Pinkerton detectives were always just one step behind Cassidy and his gang. Sundance began courting a lovely schoolteacher named Etta Place, a lady who craved adventure. She became part of the gang, casing banks and laying the groundwork for robbery. Traveling in style with thousands in stolen money, Butch, Sundance, and Etta Place vacationed in bustling New York City. In its huge buildings, streetcars, and other technological miracles, they saw the dawn of the 20th century and the death of the Wild West. Nickelodeons showed outlandish moving picture versions of Western gunfights and train robberies and the preposterous dime novel escapades that made Billy the Kid infamous. In Fort Worth, Butch, Sundance, and friends posed as gentlemen for a formal photograph. It was typical of Cassidy's humor. He knew the days of easy robbery were fading fast in the U.S. Butch, Sundance, and Etta Place began again in South America. The cruder banks in Argentina and Bolivia were easy pickings for veteran Yankee bandidos. In 1907, Etta returned to New York with Sundance. Legend says Etta had an appendectomy, then moved to Denver, Colorado to recuperate. In tactful vernacular of that era, an appendix operation often indicated either an abortion or a secret birth. For whatever reason, Sundance got roaring drunk in Denver, shot up a saloon, and left Etta forever, rejoining his friend Butch. Back in Bolivia, the legend came to an end in 1908, but not without drama and mystery. According to the Standard story, an armed troop of Bolivian troops trapped the bandits and shot them both. Others say only Sundance was killed by soldiers' bullets. Hopelessly, Butch turned his own gun on himself. But Butch's kin insist he survived, returning to Utah, visiting his sisters and brothers as late as 1929, and died quietly in 1937 at the age of 71. The FBI called it the perfect crime. It was the biggest haul in the annals of American crime, nearly $3 million in cash and securities. And the culprits would have gotten away except for two things: stupidity and greed. The name Brinks was synonymous with security. Like their familiar armored trucks, Brinks' warehouse on Prince Street in Boston was impregnable. At least that's what the company wanted the world to believe. The idea began in the brain of Tony Pino, a Boston wise guy of no great distinction. For a year, he envisioned a vault full of cash inside the North Terminal warehouse. Pino spent a year observing the building, following armored cars around Boston, casing the neighborhood. Slowly, he assembled a team, each one a specialist. There was Joe McGinnis, an ex-boxer and tavern owner; Tony Costa, Tony Pino's brother-in-law; Jazz Maffey; Henry Baker, specialist in locks and keys; Vinnie Geegan, ruthless muscle man; Barney Banfield, expert on burglar alarms; Vinnie Costa, getaway driver, lookout; Stanley Gus Kusura, and his elder partner Joseph O'Keefe, small-timer nicknamed Specs, who became de facto captain of the team. Meticulously, patiently, they laid the groundwork. Their investigation showed that the building actually had only one alarm, on the vault itself. At first, exploratory teams forced the outside locks to get in. Then they ingeniously unscrewed and removed each lock and had Henry Baker make duplicate keys, replacing the locks before the Brinks day shift returned. With access to the building, they made detailed maps, figuring the fastest way in and out of the money room. The operation had to be early in the evening before the Brinks guards set the night alarm. Disguises were purchased months in advance. Guns were procured through discreet channels. After 2 years of planning and rehearsal, into action. The night of January 17, 1950 was cold and wet. Vinnie Costa gave the signal a few minutes before 7 o'clock. The men dressed in matching rubber masks and caps, crepe-soled shoes for silent footsteps, gloves to prevent fingerprints. They carried rope, tape, loaded guns, and sacks ready to be filled with cash. Led by Specs O'Keefe, 7 men entered the building using their duplicate keys. Following a path they knew by heart, the 7 robbers maneuvered through the silent building and into their target. At first, the guards thought it was a gag, a bunch of kids wearing Halloween masks. Then guns. Gus Kusura tied the guards with rope and taped their mouths closed. When they spoke, it was never above a whisper, the better to disguise their voices. The robbers stuffed cash into the payroll bags laying in the vault, throwing aside the bags they'd brought themselves. As a precaution, they tossed the Brinks guards' guns into the sacks with the loot. A buzzer went off suddenly. Specs and Vinnie Geegan checked, guns ready. They spotted the source of the noise, a guard, William Morton, on his lunch break. They held their breath. Without noticing anything wrong, Morton left, never knowing how close he came to spoiling a robbery or death. The bandits worked against the clock, piling cash into bags and carrying it out. It was a half ton of loot. but time was running short. They relayed the bags downstairs to a waiting truck. Even Fat Tony Pino joined in the heavy lifting. Wheelman Vinny Costa parked a sedan near the end of the street, ready to block off any unexpected visitors. The job was precisely planned. There was plenty of cash left, but they couldn't risk exceeding their schedule. Specs rushed back upstairs while the gang finished loading. Fluttered on the floors like snow. There was $1 million left, but time was gone. Specs never found his hat. He checked the guards once more and got out. The truck pulled away from the building and drove into the night. They ended up with $1,218,000 in cash. There was another $1,557,000 in securities. The securities were taboo. They could be traced. Specs O'Keefe ordered all the new cash to be burned. That, too, was traceable. That left $1 million to be divided among them. The plan still had a little ways to go. The gang members lie low, avoiding spending any loot until the heat was off. The vehicles would be junked in wreckage yards as far from Boston as possible. Police didn't have many clues: the rope and masking tape, and one cat. Brinks offered a $100,000 reward, but no one came forward. Boston police figured it to be out-of-towners. They didn't believe any local crooks were smart enough for the Brinks job. In a way, they were right. Some of the new bills started showing up. Against Specs' advice, others in the gang were spending the haul. That kept police and the FBI focused on Boston. Specs stuck to his shaky alibi, his house under constant police observation. He slipped away and drove out of town with Gus Kusura. The two men knocked over a gun shop, stealing weapons and cash. A sharp-eyed gas station attendant spied their car after the gun store robbery. Specs and Gus were busted, and the two men were soon jailed, tried, and sent to prison for the minor holdup. Gus died in prison. Serving a 6-year term, Specs always swore he kept silent about the Brinks job, waiting to return for his share of the $1 million. As planned, the getaway truck had been dismembered by an acetylene torch into hundreds of pieces, but the parts had been thrown away in a dump nearby. Investigators found a pistol of one of the Brinks guards in the wreckage. When the building next to the Brinks warehouse was burglarized with the same modus operandi, Boston police suspected the same gang, and the signs slowly pointed toward little Tony Pino and his pals. Specs was paroled in 1954 and returned to Boston. Tony Pino paid Specs far less than he expected, about $64,000 less, figuring Specs had squealed out in exchange for a reduction in his prison sentence. Then Tony Pino hired Trigger Burke, whose machine gun nearly killed Specs O'Keefe in the Dorchester area of Boston. The psychotic hitman sprayed 90 bullets through the air, nearly killing a little girl. Specs was wounded, but survived. Betrayed and nearly murdered, Specs did what he had been accused of doing in prison: talked. Boston police rounded up the remaining gang members. A jury found them guilty on all 108 counts. 5 years was the standard term for robbery, but considering the size and notoriety of the robbery, the judge gave all the culprits life in prison. J. Edgar Hoover proclaimed the Brinks job proved that subversive communists were behind organized crime. No one understood the connection except Hoover. The FBI investigation took 6 years and cost $29 million, 10 times the total haul. As for Specs O'Keefe, he received 4 years, the same length of time he spent sitting in prison, waiting for his share of the biggest heist of the 20th century.
Cooper was a kind of I think you could call him a Walter Mitty kind of man. Ever since boyhood, he bolstered his self-confidence by fantasizing wild adventures in which he, of course, was the hero. And during the middle part of his life, at the age of about 40 to 45, things fell apart for the man. His marriage turned sour. His job, his career kind of came to a halt. He found himself in a typical middle-aged, dead-ended situation. And through a long chain of circumstances, he gradually goaded himself into committing the bizarre crime of air piracy, which until then had hardly ever attempted before. He more or less invented this crime.
Thievery is the most understandable crime of all, usually. Unlike murder, the motive is not often hatred or jealousy or power or insanity. People generally steal for one reason. They want money. They robbed banks, companies, and individuals because they were greedy. The motive of the high-profile crime of hijacking an airliner was almost invariably political. In the 1960s and 70s, scores of American and European jet flights were hijacked to communist Cuba. Unlike professional criminals who prefer staying in those, hijackers use their acts of industrial terrorism to make some sort of public statement about the corruption of Western civilization. Many hijackers naively thought Cuba would offer them a sanctuary. In a way, it did. Supreme Leader Fidel Castro invariably had them thrown into prison. But the most bizarre combination of theft and hijacking had no apparent motive. The hijacker had no political agenda, nor was he overly greedy. D.B. Cooper was a polite, intelligent man who apparently committed his one and only crime for the same reason Sir Edmund Hillary climbed Mount Everest and Jacques Cousteau dove to the bottom of the sea, because it was there. D.B. Cooper committed one spectacularly successful crime in his career and then simply vanished back into obscurity. To locals in the Pacific Northwest, he's a folk hero, as mythic in his own way as Paul Bunyan, and just as beloved.
Oh, I think he's still alive. I think he's smarter than everybody thinks he is.
Sure he's alive. Alive and well, living in New York.
Cooper is right here in this place at this very minute.
Where is he?
Well, that's the problem. Everybody got to have to figure it out.
But according to Ralph Himmelsbach, the FBI agent who tracked him, Cooper was less than admirable. As far as he was concerned, he was just another sleazy, rotten criminal. The year was 1971. A lone man identified only by the alias of D.B. Cooper apparently got away with his life and a $200,000 ransom, parachuting from an airborne jet into criminal history. It was the day before Thanksgiving, 1971. In the holiday rush, ticket counter clerks paid little attention to the slim, middle-aged man who bought a one-way ticket on Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305. The route from Portland, Oregon to Seattle, Washington was a straightforward hop, which took less than an hour. The man gave his name as Dan Cooper, although he offered no identification. The tall, well-groomed man, about 40, with a slightly olive cast to his complexion, sat near the rear of the plane. The crew and other passengers recalled the man only as quiet and well-mannered. Once Flight 305 was airborne, Cooper told a stewardess that he had a bomb in his briefcase, flashing the woman a quick glimpse of what did indeed look like a bomb. He demanded $200,000 in $20 bills and 4 parachutes. At the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, Cooper did as he promised, released all 36 passengers, plus all but 3 of the flight crew. He released the final 3 stewardesses upon receipt of his ransom, then ordered the pilot to fly the plane to Mexico. The pilot informed Cooper that they would have to stop in Reno, Nevada to refuel. Cooper nodded. The pilot and co-pilot closed the door to the passenger cabin and flew southeast as directed. Local authorities, the FBI and the Federal Aviation Authority, bided their time and tracked the plane by radar as it flew southeastward. Professional and amateur criminologists tried to second-guess the next stop of the plane. Would this quiet man in sunglasses order another stop at another airport for refueling? Was Mexico really his objective? And if not, how far away was his destination? Would Cooper try ordering the jet across country to Cuba or some other safe haven? If so, then the State Department would have to secure a quick local arrest and extradition for Cooper's return for trial. They wondered if he had a confederate, even a team. He might order the jet to crash land on some abandoned field in the wilds of eastern Oregon and try to escape by car. State police in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Nevada, and Utah went on alert. Reports from the pilot assured ground control that everything was all right, so far. Then, when the plane landed at the Reno, Nevada airport for refueling, Cooper was no longer aboard. But the rear emergency door underneath the jetliner's tail was open. D.B. Cooper was never seen again. Investigators believed Cooper bailed out at 10,000 for southern Washington, carrying his ransom, parachuting into a howling wind and freezing rain. As far as the pilots knew, Cooper wore only his street shoes and a business suit, but they had not actually seen him for nearly an hour. Given the facts, the unofficial FBI attitude was that Cooper perished in his escape attempt. Despite an intense search, no body was ever discovered. A list of the serial numbers of the 10,000 $20 bills had been prepared. The FBI knew from experience that if Cooper survived, eventually he would start to spend the money. And sooner or later, the money would work its way into circulation and establish a trail back to the skyjacker. But it never happened. 9 years later, about 10 miles north of Oregon, an 8-year-old Vancouver, Washington boy named Brian Ingram was digging in the sand on the banks of the Columbia River when he uncovered some of the cash.
Well, we were going to make a campfire, and we found it. It was partially on top of the ground, you know. It was just beneath the sand.
Who found it?
Well, my son and I found it together. I was getting ready to drop the wood, and he cleared out the spot and rolled the money over on top of the sand.
D.B. Cooper returned to the headlines. The FBI cordoned off the beach and excavated a bit more of the money, but no sign of D.B. Cooper. Agent Ralph Hemmelsbach considered the money an indication that Cooper died in his leap from the plane. Local fans disagreed. For one thing, the rotting cash was found in neat little stacks, indicating it had not just swept up onto the beach, but had been deliberately buried there. For another thing, the flight path of the hijacked jet was several hundred miles east. Northwest Orient Flight 305 never would have flown over that location. And one more intriguing clue, the money was found less than 10 miles from Portland, Oregon, where D.B. Cooper's adventure began in 1971. Author Max Gunther offered an intriguing theory in D.B. Cooper, What Really Happened. Gunther, who wrote true crime and adventure books, said that within 3 months of the hijack of Flight 305, he received a typed letter from a man who claimed to be Cooper.
He said he had admired some magazine articles I'd written, and he said that he wanted to tell his stories, and he had chosen me as his pipeline. And if I was interested in telling the story, my instructions from him were to place a classified newspaper ad saying, "Happy Birthday, Clara." Well, of course, I placed the ad to find out what was going to happen, but after another brief letter and a equally brief phone call, the man broke off all communication, and I never heard from him again. That was in 1972. 10 years went by, and then in 1982, I received a phone call from a woman who identified herself as Clara. And Clara said that the man called Cooper was now dead of natural causes, and she would like to tell his story, and that since I was the man that he would have chosen, she was choosing me.
If the story Clara told Gunther was true, then D.B. Cooper's single extraordinary act was not so much a criminal act as the acting out of an impossible fantasy.
It was really not a very big crime as crimes go. The amount of money he stole, where he took in ransom, was $200,000, which is not a huge amount, really. It was a non-violent crime in which nobody was hurt. There was no chance anyone could get hurt except the hijacker himself. And because of those facts, and also because he carried out a typical dream of an ordinary middle-class person busting loose from the system, because of that, people admired him, and I've got to admit, I sort of admire him too.
The true identity of D.B. Cooper has never been discovered. The case remains officially unsolved and is on record as the nation's only unsolved skyjacking.